Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Major cheating drama back on the menu going into the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Fernando Alonso predicted after Brazil that some of Aston's close rivals were playing around with ride height, putting their car too low to the ground, taking too much plank wear based on what is allowed, but cheating the regulations and getting away with it because the FIA simply were not checking. But apparently the FIA were checking in Brazil, and what they found was that Alonso was right, but not exactly in the way that he initially believed. Another special trick apparently that some of these teams have been using to run their car closer to the ground than they should legally be able to. Which teams have been doing this? To what end have they been taking it to these advantages? And also, what other teams might need to start doing this if they want any chance of now to the end of the season? Lots to get into today. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Las Vegas is this weekend, an interesting timing for the Grand Prix. It's, well, a late night one in Vegas. It's a very early morning one over here in Europe, and we'll discuss the implications of that in a second. Before we get there, we have some special liveries. You might think it's just the Alpine, isn't it? But no, there is a little bit more pink on this car. Notably a little bit, but anyway, it's pink and blue. There's a bit more pink than we have seen before. That's the Alpine special livery, they're calling it for the weekend. Speaking of pink and blue, looks like Oscar Piastri is running it back. He's got this McLaren lid for the weekends with the Alpine colours on. So, you know, he's running it back to when he was an Alpine driver before the famous tweet and the drama resulted. Probably my favourite special livery for the weekend is this one from Williams. They've gone for a really nice deep black with the navy blue. And okay, obviously they've got plenty of sponsors, logos, plasters all over it, but, you know, that's a pretty good looking livery as far as I'm concerned. I think under the lights of Vegas, it's going to look pretty nice as well with the blue and the purple outlines and all that. So that's the Williams of the weekends, just to keep it in mind, because, you know, when some of these Grand Prix, they do tons of special liveries, and it can be difficult sometimes to say, is that the Williams? Is that the Mercedes? What's going on here? That is the Williams. This will take no recognition at all. It's the steak, the Sauber, whatever. But they've put this checkered flag thing going all over it. So, you know, maybe getting waved when they're in the points with any luck for them, but maybe not. Okay, they say it's special. It's basically the same livery, but at least it's somewhat different, I suppose. Those are the special liveries. This is not a livery. This is an outline of the preview of the weekend. So we're using the same compounds as last year. C3, C4, C5, no C6 used in Vegas. They could have played around with it, but we know the C6 has been very fragile to such an extent that if you have the C6 as the soft, the teams will often like to use the C5 medium as their qualifying tyre. That will probably not be an issue this weekend. They'll be on the C5 for qualifying rather than messing around with the C4. But I think it's the same tyres as last year. Last year did lean a two-stop race, so presumably a similar development this year as well. But we'll see, depends on conditions. It is going to be pretty cold. It's not going to be deathly cold. Low 40s Fahrenheit, maybe 7 or 8 Celsius, 8, 9 Celsius, something in that ballpark. So it's definitely going to be cold. This will have implications for what the teams decide to do. Couple of other talking points as well. Something that hasn't really been massively discussed is the possibility that Max Verstappen is out of the championship after this round. Yes, he made that miraculous comeback in Brazil, but Lando has put points on him over the last couple of weekends. Now he's 49 points behind. It's a big gap with just 3 rounds to go. Max needs to win in Vegas. He needs an absolute McLaren disaster class. And then effectively the same again for the next couple of weekends. Not impossible by any means. The bookmakers have it at about a 5% likelihood that Max pulls this off, but it's pretty slim. And there is a chance that Lando just ends it right here, right now, especially compared to Verstappen. If Norris gains 9 points, so if Lando wins and Max is third, that's it, right? The championship is over. Even if they go on to tie in points at the end of the season, if Lando were to win, then he would have too many victories and Max wouldn't have enough to win or count back, basically. So, you know, he could get the job done this weekend, Lando, in terms of eliminating the Max Verstappen threat. But I think that's relatively unlikely because I'm not expecting McLaren to be great. I think Max will come on strong. We know that Max has got that brand new engine as well in the back of the car. That certainly cannot be hurting at a power circuit like Vegas. And to be fair, it's true for the last few Grand Prix that additional power will be especially useful. So I think Max is going to be well positioned over the last few Grand Prix. But McLaren, Norris especially, just needs to hold his own, as it were, and it should be his championship to lose. But there is a possibility that he ends Verstappen's title charge at the Grand Prix where he won it last year, right, in Vegas. Of course, he won at Qatar the year before. Which threat, apart from McLaren, Red Bull, is going to be the biggest from the other teams? Because Mercedes dominated this Grand Prix last year, and they will be hoping, maybe even expecting, to maybe do the same. I don't think expecting, but Vegas should be good for Mercedes. The straight lines, the low-speed corners, traction, low temperatures, they should be strong again. Ferrari were also pretty good last year as well. Famously, that Leclerc overtake on Perez still lives kind of rent-free. So maybe there's an opportunity for those two teams to be a threat. Ferrari wasn't great for them last year, but the last couple of years they've been okay at Vegas since they came on the calendar in 2023. Vasseur says, though, that the race last year was quite late. This year it's a little bit different, so, quite extreme on the tyres. Maybe there's another option, because they're doing it a little bit earlier in the day. I think the race is like 5 a.m. European time, so it is a little earlier in Vegas time, which is 8 hours behind the UK, but it's not dead of night. But it's not especially early, right? So the temperatures won't be too cold, presumably, so maybe that will help some of the teams. It's definitely going to affect the way that some of these teams decide to set up their car. Ferrari also have been in lots of drama lately, as we know. Leclerc had a few comments and said, look, it's not enough when you drive for such a team. The only thing that's good enough is to win. But he also said in another statement that this season's actually not been that bad. It's obviously been detrimental and very frustrating. But I don't know, they're still in the fight for second, I suppose, but they're so far behind McLaren that there's no other way to look that it's been an absolute disaster. There is a rumour as well that they're looking to copy McLaren. We know that next year they're moving away from their suspension design. So what a mess with Ferrari over the last few years when it comes to suspensions. Effectively, Adrian Newey, 2022, he designed the Red Bull suspension from scratch for that first year for the RB18, and he went pull rod front suspension, push rod rear suspension. That has become the standard in this era of regulations. Ferrari had the complete opposite of that, push rod front, pull rod rear. This year, they swapped, didn't they? They went for a pull rod front as well, in addition to a pull rod rear. So that was their big swap this season. Has it really worked? No. And next year, apparently they're going back to a push rod front suspension, which they tend to prefer. But they're also switching to a push rod rear suspension, which now Mercedes and McLaren have adopted over the last couple of years. So McLaren went to that as well, kind of following the Newey lead. McLaren have now obviously made some advances there. Mercedes have gone down a similar route. They've got research into innovative materials to reduce weight, have Ferrari as well. So yeah, Ferrari are all over the place really in terms of their last few years. Maybe they should have swapped a little bit earlier, but the front suspension, the rumour was, push rod, pull rod, doesn't massively matter. From a technical perspective, there were rumours that from an aerodynamic perspective, it could be advantageous in that era of regulations. But in 2026, who knows, right? But the general feeling is that probably what they do on the front suspension doesn't massively matter, but in these ground effect kind of era that we're still staying in to some degree, no Venturi tunnels from next year, but ground effect is still going to be relevant to some extent. The feeling is that maybe push rod rear is the way to go. Maybe Ferrari could have figured that out earlier, but they've done pull rod rear suspensions for the last 15 Formula 1 cars. You've got to go back to 2010 until they had the other way around. We'll see what the other teams roll out of the garage with next year, but that's the rumour early doors on Ferrari suspension. But let's talk about this big cheating drama that continues to emerge. You guys remember a few days ago we talked after the Brazilian Grand Prix, technically the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, isn't it? But whatever, you know what I'm talking about. Alonso says that he doesn't want to say too publicly what he's thinking here. He can't be completely honest. But he had this suspicion that some of their key rivals were lowering the ride height of their car to gain performance on the opportunity that they would score points and effectively get away with it. So Alonso basically said he thinks that their rivals, they're not doing this, Aston, although maybe they should, because as we discussed at the time, it might even be a little bit of a no-brainer. On some level, if you are 11th, you score 0 points. If you lower the ride height by 0.5 millimeter, you may be 9th. But is your car going to get checked for plank wear? Not necessarily. The top 5 cars get checked, then there's a couple of other random ones. But if you finish 6th or 7th, then the chances are you're probably not going to get your car checked anyway. You still score a boatload of points. And if you get disqualified, well, you were probably going to score 0 points anyway if you didn't push the limits, as it were. So Alonso had a suspicion that some of their rivals, Aston's close rivals in the championship, given there's, $10 million on the line for every single position gains, it's an absolute dogfight right now between Racing Bulls, Sauber, Aston Martin, and Haas. Of course, Alpine somewhat cut adrift, but those 4 teams just mentioned, it could go either way for any of those teams as we go down to the wire. So understandable that there will be some games being played here, but apparently those games are being played in a slightly different way, but Alonso was not necessarily wrong. So there was some discussion that, well, if the other teams are doing it, why doesn't Aston do it as well? You get disqualified for 0 points. If you ride the car too high, you get 0 points. So understandably, there is some incentive to play around with this. Now, apparently Joe Bauer of the FIA decided to have a look at some of these cars. So we know that earlier in the season in China, there was a lot of drama because Ferrari won the sprints. Hamilton, won the sprint, of course, famously, and only his second weekend with Ferrari looked like things were really moving in a good direction at that time. But they won the sprint. The next day, they got disqualified for plank wear. Presumably, they ran the car too low in the sprints, but it was fine because there was only a third race distance, so the plank wear wasn't as bad. But if you then run the same spec for the Sunday, you're going to have a couple of issues, and the other team has made some improvements anyway, so they weren't quite as competitive on the Sunday regardless, but they still got disqualified. So this article coming out of Autosport Japan today goes into some detail on what exactly is going on. So this image on the top right, just to kind of explain exactly what's happening, this is the wooden plank on the floor, and the plank in certain spots has these titanium skid plates, and the plank is checked for wear in a couple of different locations. And if it's worn more than 1mm of the 10mm thickness, so it's 1 centimeter thick, if it's worn a millimeter, more than a millimeter, then it's banned, right? It's over, you've cheated or whatever, the car's illegal, it doesn't matter. Now, cheating, of course, is kind of a grey area because this can happen accidentally, you just get it wrong. Ferrari in Hungary, for example, we believe that they massively raised the ride height of Leclerc's car by increasing the tyre pressures in the final stints, and that killed his performance, but it meant they weren't illegal. They at least scored a couple of points at the end of the Grand Prix. But had they not decided to do that and just hoped that it would be okay and hoped that they would get away with it, that was Mercedes' theory anyway, would they have cheated, or would they have just taken a risk that meant their car was illegal? A bit of a grey area there, but the point still stands that the teams are messing around with this stuff because you can gain major performance from doing this. And it has been a talking point throughout the season, especially Ferrari, I'm sure, would be in favour of saying, well, you know what, screw this plank wear rule. We should just run the car where we want and, come what may, right? They introduced it, not entirely, but a couple of years ago there was talk about mandating ride heights because of the bouncing, the porpoising issues that was affecting the driver's health and their spines. So they did say, look, you can't run the car too low because you're going to bottom out, you're going to cause issues, but maybe these rules aren't so fit for purpose. I'm sure that some teams would argue that. And of course, they're going to try and get around the rules, right? They're going to try and run the car as low as they can, and apparently this is what they are doing to achieve it. So there are titanium skid plates located in 3 areas of the plank on the underside of the car. They must, under current technical regulations, be made of titanium alloy manufactured in accordance to AMS 4928 or AMS 4911 standards. These elements must be positioned exactly at the same height as the plank and form a smooth surface with the plank. By measuring the surface wear after each practice qualifying a race session, teams can therefore calculate how much wear the plank will have over the course of a race and try and maintain a prescribed thickness to avoid disqualification. So the teams are doing this every single weekend. But apparently, certain teams have found ways to make those titanium plates absorb a lot of heat. And by absorbing a lot of heat, the plate then expands and drops it down below the level of the plank. Therefore, that will eat up a load of the wear, and the plank itself will effectively get away with it, right? So only the skids then come in. I mean, this is F1, right? It's beautiful in some respects. But the idea of making those titanium plates, which aren't meant to move anywhere, but allowing them to expand, even let's say they expand by 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters downwards, might not even be that. The point is they will then eat up the bulk of the wear, they will hit the ground, the plank gets away scot-free, and then when you come to test it, it's perfectly legal despite running the car very low to the ground. So this is apparently what's been happening, and when they come back to the pits, that heat dissipates, and then when the stewards check it, it's like, oh, it's perfectly level, right? They're perfectly in line, but actually there's a bit of trickery going on. So, during the sprints, there was a lot of bottoming of some of the cars, and FIA's technical delegate Joe Bauer decided to look at all the cars' skid blocks for compliance, and according to some sources, found that there have been devices fitted to several cars for the sole purpose of heating the skids and ordered them to be removed. So, the idea is they're using a certain alloy of titanium. Maybe they found another slight variation of that which expands more with heat than some others, but they've also, they've got like devices on the cars that are heating the skid blocks so that they can get away with it when the race gets underway properly. Now, apparently, this then affected performance of some teams. The same source says that while virtually every team uses the technology to a varying degree, a few have found it particularly effective at circuits with smooth surfaces where the car can be lowered extremely low, therefore increasing the downforce. And apparently, the FIA is therefore working on a technical directive that would ban the use of certain materials, but it's unlikely to happen yet. So apparently, the FIA looked at some of these cars and said, wow, you guys are using, you're trying to cheat the system here, right? Because this would be cheating. If Ferrari accidentally get their ride height wrong and they get disqualified, it's not cheating, they've just been incompetent. But if you're using something to deliberately get around the rules in a grey area way, it's pretty close to cheating even if you don't want to call it that. So is this what Aston, their rivals, have been doing? Are the top teams doing this? I think that's the interesting question, because Alonso thought it was just their close rivals, really. It was just people around Aston Martin, Sauber, Haas, Racing Bulls, potentially. But who knows? Maybe some of the top teams have also been doing similarly so they can run their car lower and effectively get away with it. Maybe it's only being discovered right now, because apparently the FIA looked at loads of these cars and were like, yeah, that ain't gonna fly. And stop doing this, guys. But, they're going to turn up to Vegas and do a similar thing. Vegas isn't as smooth, so probably you've got to run the ride height higher anyway. So it's remarkable if maybe this cheating has been going on for some time. It's only being discovered 4 races before the end of the entire rule cycle. And even then, it might not even be that relevant for the final few Grand Prix. Qatar, quite possibly it will be, because relatively smooth surfaces there as well. The reason I brought up these numbers, because apparently after the sprints, they then told them you can't do that anymore. And then for the main race, presumably there were performance changes there. But did we see many? Really? Not to a great extent, right? In terms of the relative performance. Of course, the sprints, there's a lot of traffic, and like Behrman had the spin early on, so it kind of took things a little bit out of context, right? So it's not clear looking at the data that there were any teams that massively fell off. It may not be too surprising that teams are continuing to play around with the rules, but to do so in this way is pretty fascinating and does make me wonder whether, Ferrari might need to figure out whether they can do the same thing. I'm sure Ferrari would have thought about these ideas, but, it's interesting that the implication of the article anyway is that it's not necessarily Ferrari that are doing this or some other team that are doing this, and maybe it's actually is some of Aston's close competitors that are kind of pioneering the way when it comes to gaining these type of advantages. Maybe it's the top teams as well. We know what it's like in F1. Everyone's got to try and push the boundaries, and well, it seems that maybe the teams recognize that other teams were doing this, but they probably kept it quiet because they were doing it as well, and the FIA have now caught on, but rather too late to do much about it. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.